1957, Jack Laverick, a boat builder from Lake Macquarie, invited his three sons, Don, Peter and John, to form a boat building and maintenance company on Newcastle Harbour. Jack had worked in the shipbuilding industry in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, and had travelled the world. At the beginning of the Second World War, due to the lack of shipping out of Port Moresby, he and a mate made the perilous journey from New Guinea to Australia by canoe. The next few years would see him try his hand at many things before returning to boat building and repair work. Jack and his sons leased a run-down, disused boatyard on the harbour front at Carrington, with a rickety wharf and a hand-operated slipway. And so Carrington Slipways began. Learning as they worked, and with the ingenuity that would characterise the company for the next 30 years, they set out to create the facilities they needed to operate and grow the business. John Laverick recalls.
I remember the early days very clearly. When we arrived there to see this old shed and a hand winch down there, and Dad had all these great ideas about what we could do, but I didn't quite appreciate it. There was no money in those days to do things. We had to use all our ingenuity to achieve the results that we wanted, and we built the shed and the wharf out of second-hand material. The company vehicle at that stage was my Ford Zephyr, which we used to go around to the wharves and collect all the second-hand timbers and the wool sheds, and that's what we used to build our wharf with, our first wharf. In the first weeks, the boss had us whitewashing inside the shed so we could see some more, and he went out and bought second-hand parts to mechanise second-hand truck and tank gearboxes to mechanise the slipway and make it bigger so we didn't have to wind it up.
Even before the wharf was started, they tendered for their first contract, a vehicular wooden ferry for the New South Wales Department of Main Roads.
The Swedish engineer in charge, Mr. Midvik, told me, he said, when you submitted the tender, he said you had no employees, no experience building ferries. He said, and you wanted to build this one upside down on a wharf that didn't exist. And he said, we were so impressed with the presentation that we gave the job to see how you could do it. And that's how it all began.
To everyone's surprise but their own, they won the contract to build the ferry. Unable to afford the expense of driving piles, they built the wharf by setting pile stumps on top of the sandy bottom. Despite their less than optimal facilities, they built the cable ferry in 7 months. This was the first of 3 cable ferries they would go on to construct for the New South Wales DMR. In Don Laverick's words,
built several more cable-operated vehicular ferries, and then we built our first decent-sized steel ship, self-propelled ocean-going ship, and she's still operating out of Darwin today.
In 1958, they completed their first steel commercial vessel, Little Toot. Pioneering a novel way of building steel vessels, they built Little Toot upside down, turning it prior to launch. Though unconventional, this became Carrington Slipways' signature method of construction because it enabled the welders to work downhand rather than overhead. Thus, they could properly fill the angled joints between the hull plates, creating stronger welds in less time. Welding this way also required less power, reducing the tendency of hull plates to buckle from the heat. In 1962, Carrington Slipways achieved their first major success, winning the contract to build 2 ocean-going dredging spoil barges for the Maritime Services Board. This contract enabled the firm to improve the equipment and facilities at the Carrington Yard. A string of smaller vessels was followed in 1964 by the Koori Pearl, a live pearl shell carrier for the pearl industry in Broome. She was followed by a landing barge, and then a tug, and a series of 60-foot ore barges for the nickel industry in New Caledonia. Carrington Slipways not only built but delivered these vessels, the first of 9 delivery voyages across the Coral Sea and into the Southeast Pacific. These oceanic delivery voyages were to prove both challenging and entertaining. In one incident, on a tow to New Caledonia, a string of 6 ore barges broke loose in a mid-ocean storm. 4 barges were recovered quickly, but after 3 weeks of searching, 2 were still missing. So the company chartered a long-range twin-engine search plane out of Coffs Harbour. and spent several hours sweeping the Pacific out towards Lord Howe Island. They found the barges, but on the return journey, they ran so low on fuel that John pulled out the plane's life raft and prepared to ditch. They lost the first engine as they approached the coast. They then had to decide whether to risk flying over Coffs Harbour Township directly to the airport or to avoid the town by flying around it. They took the longer route, and flying on one engine and a mixture of vapour and prayer, they made it onto the runway. Seconds after touching down, the second engine died. By the end of its first decade in operation, the company had around 50 employees and apprentices and was building a reputation based on quality and a can-do attitude. The second decade of Carrington Slipways' story begins at the Carrington Yard, as the company began construction on a succession of bigger vessels. Early builds included pontoons, barges and big fishing boats. In 1968, the company built the Devara, a timber pilot launch for Port Moresby Harbour. Partly to provide continuing employment for their workforce, they also spec-built a line handler work vessel, which was subsequently sold and shipped to Bougainville as a workboat at the copper mine. This was followed in 1968 by the Maoya, a tug which was built and delivered to New Caledonia, and the Fourcroy, a landing vessel which was delivered to Darwin. The 200-foot-long, 1,650-tonne Sedco Helen followed in 1968, an oil rig supply ship with a 6,000-kilometre range, built to service the drilling rigs in the Bonaparte Gulf, northwest of Darwin.
First oil rig supply ship we built was for a company called Sedco, Southeastern Drilling Company of Texas. We built it in 12 months, which was their requirement, and got it to Darwin in that time. The can-do, or we will do it, attitude of our people at that time was incredible.
Completing the Sedco Helen was a significant achievement in the life of Carrington Slipways. In 1969, the firm built the Tom Tough, the first of 25 tugs built for Howard Smith Industries, which operated tugs in ports around Australia. The Tom Tough was a watershed in the firm's history. Designed by Tom Barnes, teacher at the local Newcastle Technical College, it was a powerful, durable twin-screw vessel with a 22-tonne bollard pull. About this time, in addition to completing a growing list of significant commercial vessels of all kinds, they were appointed sales and service agents for Beaufort life rafts. 1970 was a very busy year. Carrington's completed the Lady Lorna and Lady Laurie oil rig supply ships, as well as building and delivering the tug Catherine and a number of ore barges to New Caledonia. In their usual pioneering style, Carrington's had developed a method of towing barges across the Pacific, clamshell style, with one 30-tonne barge inverted and mounted on top of another. On delivery, each pair of barges would be unbolted and the gasket between them removed. The supporting barge would be filled with water until it rolled sideways, and both barges hung vertically in the water. At this point, the barges separated and floated apart. On one of the earlier delivery voyages, a slight navigation error resulted in a tug and a string of barges crashing up onto the New Caledonia reef. Two of the 30-tonne barges, bolted together, had landed on top of the reef, standing up on their sides. Three of the Carrington men were able to prise open an 18-inch gap between the barges, through which they slipped to work to free the vessels. Once inside, the two barges slammed shut, trapping the men as if inside a giant clam on a mid-ocean reef, on an incoming tide. After a few stunned seconds in total darkness, the barges bounced on the reef and a slight gap opened up at the top. The men shot out through the hole like rabbits. Overnight, the barges righted themselves and were pulled free of the reef. Meanwhile, back at the shipyard, the company were building more vessels each year, and the facilities were becoming too cramped to handle the ever-increasing size of the ships they were building. Already, they were side-launching their ships, This is a style of ship launching pioneered in Holland, where narrow canals prevent the launching of vessels stern first. Launches at Carrington were always a major event, both for the workers and their families and for the people of Newcastle. In fact, it was worker involvement in technical and engineering decisions and participation in the launch of every vessel that gave the Carrington workforce such a strong sense of trust, purpose and achievement. Though not every launch went smoothly. Occasionally, during a launch, a large wave would race across Throsby Basin and soak the spectators. And on one occasion, while launching a hopper barge, a steadying cable was attached to the concrete foundations of a nearby building. As the vessel slipped down the slipway, the steadying cable slipped off the building's foundations, sliced through the brickwork and pulled the whole building towards the water. And Carrington Slipways almost earned the honour of becoming the first shipyard in the world to launch a toilet block. Construction continued at a rapid pace, including, in the early 70s, the completion of the vessels Careening Cove and Shell Cove, duck-pellet-powered tugs, which were the start of a line of tough, manoeuvrable Z-pellet tugs, many of which are still at work today. Construction of the tug MV masthead provides a great demonstration of Carrington Slipways' upside-down construction methods, rotating the hull sections, line assembly, fitting out and side launching into Throsby Basin. During line assembly and fitting out, the whole weight of the vessel, which could be thousands of tonnes, rested on building blocks. One of the trickier operations was removing the building blocks and transferring the weight of the ship to wooden launching ways. Carrington solved this problem by supporting the ship's weight on steel boxes filled with sand. After the launching ways were put in place, the weight of the ship was transferred to them simply by hosing out the sand. Carrington ships grew even larger and more complex. Here is a construction in 1971 of the Eugene McDermott, a specialised seismic research vessel with a helideck and onboard mainframe computer. The vessel was built for the seismic research arm of US company Texas Instruments. It would go on to survey the entire coast of Australia, building a database of major oil reserves. But the company was rapidly outgrowing its facilities at Carrington. In the late 60s, the decision was made to relocate the yard. Land was acquired some 16 kilometres up the Hunter River at Tomago. And in 1970, work commenced on digging the launch basin and constructing facilities there. The firm transferred its giant cranes upriver from Carrington to Tomago on barges. And every one of the 120 or so employees and apprentices moved with them. At last, the company could put into practice everything it had learned in a 16.9 hectare, purpose-built, highly mechanised facility. They designed and built a flow line assembly facility where a series of vessels could be worked on in a production line style. Although the Tomago facility allowed for different types of vessels to be constructed simultaneously. The layout was designed for efficiency and to enable easy movement of vessels from the building yard to the slipway. Following fact-finding visits to shipbuilders in Japan and the UK, the company installed the latest lofting and engineering technology, including some of the first computer-controlled cutting machines and lathes. Here, owner designs are transferred to punch tape recordings, which controlled the flame cutting machines. And here, in the plate cutting shop, port and starboard plates are cut simultaneously. In May 1972, the Roeburn, the company's first ship built at the new Tomago yard, was launched, a 31-metre tug built for the West Australian mining industry. And at this time, Jack Laverick, after a creative, eventful and illustrious career, handed over management of the company to sons Don and John. A wide variety of vessels for Australian and international customers followed rapidly, including the Al Rahala and Al Rahib in 1974 for Dubai. The patrol vessel, Melbadia, built for the Queensland Government. Two prawn trawlers, Catbird and Clipperbird. The large fishing vessel, Maria Louisa. The Sydney Harbour ferry, Lady Wakehurst. And Lady Cynthia, an oil rig supply vessel. At this time, Carrington Slipways was now a significant force in the Australian shipbuilding industry, building ships up to 122 metres in length. Here, the April Hamer suction dredge is put through its test program. And this is the Lady Anne, a large supply vessel for deep-water oil rigs. About this time, a local newspaper wrote, "In 1975, as the orders and reputation of Carrington has grown, so has the workforce. 3 years ago, there were about 120 working at the yard. Now there are over 300. They're not just a group of men and women employed in the shipbuilding industry. They call themselves, and are proud to be known as, the shipbuilders of Tomago." The third decade of Carrington Slipways' existence opened in 1977 with the construction of a clamshell dredger and 2 tugs, the Broadsound and the Belliando. This dramatic launch showcased the stability of the tugs, even when tipped on their side. But before the year was out, work began on the firm's biggest ship yet, the 4,000-tonne bulk cement carrier, Goliath. At this time, the Australian government was looking to overseas yards to build ships for Australia. Other Australian ship operators followed suit. And against international competition, it took some hard bargaining to secure the contract to build the $8 million Goliath in Newcastle. Close tolerances were required during construction and launching, and precise tide calculations for such a big vessel, which on its maiden voyage downriver to Newcastle Harbour had its newly fitted masthead light neatly removed by contact with the Stockton Bridge. Goliath was followed by the Royal and Endeavour, an advanced twin-hulled cat design. The success of the Goliath led in 1977 to the signing of a $36 million contract to build an amphibious heavy-lift ship for the Royal Australian Navy, HMAS Tobruk. To complete and launch this large vessel, the company also had to build a new 150-metre-long building launching berth with 2 60-tonne travelling gantry cranes and dredge out a 160 by 100-metre launch pool alongside but separate from the river, large enough to float the ship. At this stage, the workforce increased to around 800 men and women, including a great crew of subcontractors, some of who have been with Carrington since the early days.
The superstructure for Tobruk is made of aluminium. It's been assembled upside down in sections at the slipway workshops and posed few problems. Tests were made to determine the best and most effective way to weld the structure. The few difficulties encountered are overcome, and the job of turning the section over and lifting it into position begins. As the superstructure inches into place, so for the first time does Tobruk begin to assume a recognisable shape. At this stage, the vessel is still known only by her shipyard number N138 and Navy designation L50. Another recognisable feature, the bridge is lifted into position. It too was made of aluminium. Guided by the cranes, the bridge goes into place with deceptive ease. The operation is a tribute to the skill of the ship's architects and their precise calculations. A special cantilever arm was designed to fit under the crane and help balance the funnel as it's manoeuvred into position. The L50, soon to be named HMAS Tobruk, stands ready for her big day. Among the guests for the launching are federal and state government representatives, high-ranking officers from the armed services, and people from organisations who've contributed to the construction of this, the Navy's newest ship. In this young lady's life, another big event, flowers for Lady Khan. Then, in the time-honoured manner, Lady Khan launches HMAS Tobruk. That early challenge has now become reality. Sir Selman and Lady Khan meet apprentices who worked on Tobruk, shipbuilders of the future. Sea trials for Tobruk. They'll be a complex and long-running affair. Like any vessel, she will need these trials to check her handling, engines and steering. On Tobruk's funnel, a combined Navy and Army insignia, and close by, the flag of Carrington Slipways.
Commissioned in 1981 with a planned service life of 20 years, HMAS Tobruk is still in active service in 2014, some 33 years later. This is surely an outstanding testament to the quality of the vessels built by the people of Carrington Slipways. Following HMAS Tobruk came the Flinders Tide, a pipeline inspection and rig firefighting vessel so powerful that its firefighting water jets could propel it along at 4 to 5 knots. In 1982, the firm built the Accolade II, another of Carrington's world firsts, in that it was the first vessel built to run on diesel and on natural gas. She was followed in quick succession by the Lady Kathleen, the Blackburn Cove Z pellet tug, the Tomago, a new generation of Z pellet tug with raised forecastle, the Rip, an anchor handler built for Melbourne Harbour Trust, and in 1984, the Narrabeen, one of 2 big and famous Sydney ferries. The company's third decade closed with the construction of a series of 7 catamaran-hulled bicentenary-class ferries for Sydney Harbour.
The unique twin-hull design by naval architect Alan Payne draws a maximum of only 2 metres, making it eminently suitable for operations extending right up the Parramatta River. Both the hull and the superstructure are fabricated completely from aluminium. Fishburn, the 6th vessel of the fleet, is ready for launching. The launching ceremony today will be carried out by Mrs. Stewart, wife of the current Minister for Local Transport.
Don Laverick sums up this period in the company's history.
Mineral boom was on, the oil boom was on, and in that period we built something like 55 tugs and 26 oil rig supply ships, and that was an achievement over about 15 years. In fact, one year we built 12 of those types of vessels. Very small vessels up to building the Aurora Australis, which was a real achievement, and I'm still very proud of that ship. And the fact that we got it down the river, which had a depth of 5 metres, and she had a draft of 5 metres empty, so we did that too. That was another achievement. We also built mine hunters for the Navy and HMAS Tobruk, which is still a very important part of the Australian fleet. But one of the things that I do remember very clearly was the apprentices that we trained. We trained more than 300 over a period of 30 years, and I occasionally meet some of them. They all tell me what a great place it was to work, how pleased they were to learn there, and without exception they still tell me what a great place it was to work.
In 1987, the company constructed the sleek tourist vessel, the Lady Hawkesbury. She was followed by a less leisure-oriented vessel, the twin-hull fiberglass mine hunter, HMAS Rush Cutter.
A number of dignitaries attended the launch of the new mine hunter, the HMAS Rush Cutter, including the Chief of Australia's Defence Forces, General Sir Philip Bennett, Rear Admiral Ralph, and the Federal Minister for Transport, Peter Morris. Despite the bleak conditions, the centre of today's celebration was still an impressive sight. Under construction since May 1984, the HMAS Rushcutter is of a revolutionary twin-hulled catamaran design constructed from fiberglass. This makes it completely non-magnetic, an important consideration when engaged in sensitive mine-detecting operations. With a quick snip of the ribbon, Lady Bennett sent the customary bottle of champagne cracking hard on her hull. And to the cheers of the crowd, the Rushcutter made a graceful first entry into the water. Not by the traditional big splash method, but a gentle lowering by crane. The HMAS Rushcutter will be based at HMAS Waterhen, where it will undergo an extensive trial and evaluation program before taking on general duties.
The late 80s saw the completion and launching of a number of vessels, including the bulk carrier, the Sandra Marie.
It's been a big year for Carrington Slipways, and tonight's launch of the Sandra Marie will cap that success in an equally big way. The bulk carrier follows into the water the 11 catamaran ferries built for Sydney Harbour and the 2 built for Newcastle. In May, Carrington's launched the first of 2 twin-hulled mine hunters for the Navy. Of all the ships built by the company, only the Tomago and the Accolade II have been bigger than the Sandra Marie. The owners are the Intercontinental Group, and the ship is being chartered by ICI to carry soda ash and containers from Adelaide to Sydney. What's significant for Carrington's and the whole of the Australian shipbuilding industry is that it won the contract to build such a large ship over Japanese and Korean competitors.
Well, it's a very large ship for us to build. We've built 2 like this before. The Tomago and the Accolade II, and this is a large ship that we've contracted against the Japanese and against the Koreans, and we won it, and we've been able to design and build this ship in what we consider is very good time. It's launched tonight, and we'll be able to hand it over in about 7 weeks to the owners, and we're very proud of our achievement.
The Sandra Marie is expected to make a spectacular splash when it slides into the water at 8 tonight.
It was a crowd that would have brought a glint of envy to the eye of any sporting promoter. Thousands of people, all rugged up against the night air, lined the foreshores at Carrington Slipways to see the Sandra Marie take to the water for the first time. After the speeches came the traditional blessing for a long life at sea. Then the moment the huge crowd had been waiting for. It was up to another Sandra Marie, this time Sandra Marie Cadwallader, to cut the ribbon to send her namesake gracefully down the slips into the dark water. And after a few anxious moments, the Sandra Marie was on her way. After her sea trials, the Sandra Marie will carry soda ash and containers on coastal runs around Australia.
In 1986, the John Cadman II was built for Captain Cook Cruises. This was followed by the Coleroy, sister ship to the Sydney Harbour ferry Narrabeen, which the company had built 2 years earlier. The John Cadman III and a variety of ferries, tugs and supply vessels followed, until in 1988 the company won the contract to build Australia's Antarctic research and supply vessel, the Aurora Australis. Wärtsilä Marine, Finland, was selected to design the Aurora Australis. However, partway through the build, Wärtsilä ran into problems. It took a rapid personal visit to Finland by Don, who, in a series of face-to-face meetings, was able to pry loose the required information so that Carrington's could take over the design work and complete the ship.
Carrington Slipways began work on the ship in August 1988, after the Nella Dan ran aground and had to be scuttled. This new ship comes at a price tag of $56 million, but it's more than just a ferry for explorers and scientists braving the most southern continent.
7 different ships rolled into one, an oil tanker, a passenger ship, and that's given us a lot of problems to meet the big passenger ship regulations in a small ship. It's a fishing boat, a research vessel, and it also has to be able to carry the cargo to the Antarctic.
Some vital statistics. The ship is powered by 2 medium-sized diesel engines which generate 10,000 kilowatts of power. That's about 13,000 horsepower. They'll push the 94-metre craft at a maximum speed of 15 knots, sometimes through ice up to 1.2 metres thick. It's a technological achievement of which Newcastle's many skilled people should be justifiably proud.
But global conditions were changing. Ever cheaper locations for shipbuilding were opening up around the world. Foreign governments were offering shipbuilding subsidies and low-interest finance, which were creating surplus vessels for purchase at very low prices, making it impossible to compete. In 1990, the Sea Road Tamar was launched. This was to be the last ship built at Carrington Slipways, Tomago. For over 3 decades, working at Carrington's was regarded as the most rewarding and satisfying employment. Shipbuilding is about taking plates of steel and turning them into something that will have an active life of its own. A ship sitting on the launching ways, all painted and primed, ready to go, creates great excitement. And when the axe cuts the launching trigger and the ship slides into the river with a big splash, she comes to life in celebration of the occasion. After outfit and trials, she departs for her new home, but will always remain a part of Carrington's.